They called them female eunuchs, and on April of 1421, the Forbidden City echoed with the sound of 3,000 of them dying. This was not a swift execution by a clean blade. It was a slow, methodical extermination, carried out hour after hour with bamboo rods. By sunset, the courtyard stones were so soaked in blood that architects would later recommend their replacement. But the most chilling part wasn't the massacre itself. It was the silence that followed. Imperial historians immediately went to work, not recording the horror, but erasing it, deleting an entire generation of palace women from history, their names and lives vanishing as if they had never been born. But mass murder on this scale is never random. It is a symptom of a deep sickness within the heart of an empire. So what could have happened inside the Forbidden City to provoke a massacre of such epic proportions? Why were these women called female eunuchs, and what secret was so dangerous that an emperor would choose to murder nearly 3,000 women and then erase their memory just to keep it buried? To understand how mass murder became palace protocol, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment when 13-year-old girls first heard the recruitment drums echoing through their villages. The drums echoed through village streets. Recruitment day had arrived, and mothers clutched their 13-year-old daughters, knowing they might never see them again. Every 3 years, this sound rolled across China like thunder. Imperial agents needed fresh bodies for the palace machine. 22,000 workers at its peak, with girls and women making up the vast majority. The math was simple and brutal. Select 5,000 girls from across the empire. Eliminate 4,700 through stage trials. Keep the 300 most perfectly broken. In the spring of 1407, a girl named Chen stood in a line of 1,000 others, all between 13 and 15 years old. The selecting eunuch walked past, his silk shoes barely whispering against stone. He paused at every 10th girl, studying face shapes, checking teeth like livestock at market, measuring shoulder width with painted wooden rods. The sound of crying filled the courtyard, not from the girls who'd been warned that tears meant instant rejection, but from the mothers pressed against the gates outside. The first cut eliminated 700 girls in Chen's group. Too tall, too short, too pretty, not pretty enough. The agents had quotas to fill, but standards to maintain. Palace maids needed to be invisible, attractive enough not to offend royal eyes, plain enough not to tempt them, but the selection criteria would shock even hardened slavers. They checked for body odor by making girls stand in closed rooms for hours. They tested voices by forcing them to recite poems until their throats went roar. They examined feet, hands, even the way girls breathed while sleeping. The second round was worse. Intelligence tests designed to fail most applicants. Memory trials where girls had to repeat complex instructions after hearing them once. Physical endurance challenges, standing motionless for 6 hours, carrying water jugs up endless stairs, maintaining painful positions until muscles screamed. Chen watched girl after girl collapse, saw them dragged away by guards. What happened to the 4,700 rejects remains one of history's darkest secrets. Some sources suggest they were sold to brothel. Others claimed they were simply released back to families who no longer wanted daughters soiled by imperial rejection. The truth likely varied by region and decade, but one fact remained constant. Rejection meant social death. By the third day, only 300 girls remained from Chen's original 1,000. They'd survived the cuts, proven their endurance, demonstrated the perfect balance of competence and submission. Palace representatives declared them chosen for imperial glory. The 300 winners had no idea they'd just lost everything. That night, they were loaded onto covered carts. No goodbyes allowed if families were told that emotion would disturb the girls' preparation for palace service. Chen heard her mother's wailing grow fainter as the cartwheels turned. Around her, 299 other girls sat in darkness, some praying, others already learning the first lesson of palace life. Silence was survival. The journey to the capital took weeks. At each stop, handlers reminded them of their fortune. They'd eat better than their families ever would. They'd see wonders beyond village imagination. They'd serve the Son of Heaven himself. But Chen noticed something the others missed. Their handlers never looked them in the eyes, never used their names. Already, they were being trained to disappear. And once inside those palace walls, These children would discover that their bodies and even their thoughts no longer belong to them. The first word they stole from her was the simplest one in any language, I. On Chen's first morning in the Forbidden City, the head matron gathered the new girls in a windowless chamber. The woman's face showed decades of palace service, skin pale as paper, eyes that never quite focused, movement so controlled they seemed rehearsed. She spoke in a whisper that somehow carried to every corner. From this moment you have no self. The word I is forbidden. The word me is forbidden. The word mine does not exist. Instead, they learned replacement phrases. This unworthy slave begs to eat. This lowly servant requests permission to sleep. This insignificant one has soiled herself and awaits punishment. Every self-reference required, self-degradation. Every thought had to be filtered through layers of submission before it could be spoken. The trainers used bamboo switches on girls who slipped. Quick strikes to the throat when someone accidentally said, I want, or I think. By the end of the first week, Chen heard the girl beside her whimpering in her sleep, practicing the phrases even while unconscious. This worthless body, this worthless body, this worthless body. But stealing their words was just the beginning. They couldn't own possessions. Even the clothes on their backs belonged to the palace. They couldn't own time. Every moment was scheduled, supervised, controlled. They couldn't own space. Sleeping quarters were assigned and could be changed without warning. They couldn't even own their memories. During training, girls were forced to recite new versions of their past, edited histories where their families had generously gifted them to palace service. The psychological destruction went deeper. Trainers would ask trap questions. What does this slave think about the morning meal? Any answer beginning with thought or opinion earned punishment. The correct response was always deflection. This unworthy one consumed what the palace generously provided. Even their dreams would be policed. Girls who talked in their sleep faced interrogation about what visions had disturbed their rest. Dreams of home, family, or freedom were classified as mental rebellion. Chen learned to empty her mind before sleeping, to think of black silk and nothing else. She watched other girls break under the pressure. One morning, a girl named Lin accidentally said, I, while asking for water. The punishment for accidentally saying I would haunt survivors for decades. Not just the 100 strikes with split bamboo, but the public humiliation. Lin was forced to kneel in the courtyard while other trainees took turns denouncing her selfishness. Each girl had to contribute an insult or face punishment themselves. The matrons had perfected this system over centuries. They understood that physical chains were unnecessary when mental ones were properly forged. By the end of 3 months, most girls couldn't even think in first person anymore. Their internal monologues had shifted to the required third-person degradation. Chen caught herself thinking, this slave is hungry. Instead of feeling hunger as her own sensation, some girls found creative resistance. They'd touch their faces in darkness, trying to remember what I felt like. They'd trace their names in dust when no one was watching. But these small rebellions came with enormous risk. The palace had informants everywhere. Girls who'd been broken so completely they found purpose in reporting others. The final test came after 6 months. Each girl was brought alone before a panel of senior matrons. They were asked a simple question, who are you? The correct answer was silence. Those who spoke any words, even the permitted self-degradations, had failed. They still believed in their existence enough to deny it. Only those who responded with perfect emptiness, who had truly internalized their non-existence, were allowed to proceed to palace service. Chen passed by, forgetting she'd ever been asked a question at all. Her sense of self had been so thoroughly erased that even direct interrogation couldn't find it. If they couldn't even think of themselves as human, how could they resist what came next, the complete choreography of their submission? She'd been walking backwards for 3 hours, her neck cramping, dishes balanced on trembling arms, all because turning her back on royalty meant death. The rule was absolute. No palace maid could ever show her back to anyone of imperial blood. Not the emperor, not his wives, not even the youngest prince still crawling on silk cushions. This meant developing an entirely new way of moving through space, the choreography of submission that twisted bodies into permanent damage. Chen learned the basic positions within her first week of full service. The sideways shuffle when passing royalty in corridors, pressing against walls until paint flaked onto their clothes. The backwards walk when leaving any room containing imperial presence, counting steps to avoid collision while balancing whatever they carried. The spiral turn when changing direction, a dizzying maneuver that kept faces always oriented toward their betters. But the physical demands went beyond simple positioning. Maids served meals while maintaining these contorted poses. Picture it carrying supines filled with boiling liquid, walking backwards across polished floors, neck craned to watch for obstacles, arms extended to keep the vessel as far from royal persons as possible. The kitchen staff kept count of accidents. In the summer of 1413, one accidental turn killed 12 women in a single morning when a maid tripped while backing away from the empress, sending scalding oil across a group of servants. The sleep positions broke them fastest. Even in their quarters, maids who served the inner palace had to maintain readiness poses, lying on their sides, facing the door, knees bent, ready to spring into backwards motion if summoned. They couldn't truly rest even in sleep. Senior maids would conduct midnight inspections, beating anyone found facing the wrong direction or sprawled in natural sleep positions. Chen's body began showing damage within months. A permanent curve developed in her spine from the constant backwards lean. Her neck muscles seized into spasms that lasted days. The soles of her feet, always sliding rather than stepping properly, developed chronic inflammation. The muscle damage was permanent. Decades later, elderly palace survivors could be identified on sight by their distinctive sideways gait, their heads constantly tilted, as if still checking for imperial presence. The choreography had variations for every situation. Cleaning required a crab-like sideways crawl, always keeping shoulders aligned toward the room's imperial seat, even when empty. During festivals when royalty might appear anywhere, maids moved in defensive formations, raises, groups of 4 or 6, creating human shields, so at least some could maintain proper positioning regardless of royal approach angles. Winter brought its own torments. Ice made backwards, walking lethal, but the rules never relaxed. Chen watched a girl named Y slip on frozen stones, instinctively turning to catch herself. The breach of protocol was reported immediately. Wei received 200 strikes despite her broken wrist from the fall. Protocol violations were absolute regardless of circumstance. Some developed extraordinary spatial awareness, able to navigate entire palace sections backwards without stumbling. These women became valuable, assigned to the most dangerous routes where a single misstep meant death. But even expertise couldn't prevent all accidents. The palace records, when they bothered recording servant deaths, show a steady stream of positioning-related fatalities. Women who backed off balconies downstairs into wells. The psychological toll matched the physical. Constantly monitoring their body position relative to unseen threats created a state of permanent hypervigilance. Maids developed peripheral vision so acute they could detect movement behind them. But this came at the cost of never truly focusing on anything. Their eyes darted constantly, checking angles, measuring distances, calculating escape routes that kept their faces properly oriented. Even years after leaving service, survivors maintained these movements. Jen met a woman 20 years free of the palace who still backed out of rooms, still slept in the readiness position, still felt phantom pain in her neck from checking for royalty, who no longer commanded her. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget, but the physical contortions palled compared to what they demanded of women in the emperor's bed. There, the choreography of submission would require not just controlling their movements, but suppressing every natural response their bodies could produce. The physician's instructions were precise. Breathe shallow, eyes unfocused. Suppress all muscle response. Become a corpse that happens to be warm. In the Forbidden City's inner chambers, selected maids faced demands that went beyond physical submission. They had to master the art of non-existence even while being used. The emperor and high-ranking princes required women who could provide bodily service while showing no signs of life, no hint of participation, no suggestion that they experienced anything at all. The training began with breathing exercises. Natural breath was too loud, too alive. Trainees spent hours learning to pull air silently through barely parted lips, keeping their chest still, suppressing even the smallest movement of ribs. They practiced until monitors couldn't detect respiration from an arm's length away. Any woman whose breathing was audible during service faced immediate punishment, MNO, not for disturbing royal pleasure, but for presuming to exist in that space. Next came facial control. No expression was permitted, not pain, not pleasure, not fear, not disgust. Trainers used unexpected stimuli to test responses, ice water thrown at faces, pins inserted under fingernails, sweet perfumes followed by rotting meat held under noses. Women who flinched, grimaced, or showed any reaction were beaten until they learned absolute stillness. The goal was a face so empty it resembled a porcelain mask, beautiful but lifeless. The eyes presented particular challenges. They couldn't close them, that suggested hiding or refusal. They couldn't focus them, that implied thought or awareness. The required state was a specific kind of blindness with open eyes, pupils dilated but not tracking, seeing nothing while missing nothing. Women who failed to suppress natural responses faced consequences worse than death. Some were blinded with hot needles to achieve the empty gaze artificially. Others were drugged into permanent semic consciousness. Body temperature control came next. Human skin naturally flushes or cools in response to touch, fear, or arousal. Palace women learned to suppress these responses through meditation techniques that bordered on self-hypnosis. They'd sit in ice baths while maintaining skin warmth, then transfer to steam rooms while keeping their skin cool. The training process itself killed 1 in 10 through shock, hypothermia, or heat stroke. But the ultimate test was maintaining this living death during actual service. Shen watched selected women return from the emperor's chambers, saw the particular emptiness in their faces that went beyond training. They'd learned to separate consciousness from body completely, to float somewhere outside themselves while their flesh performed its function. Some never fully returned to their bodies afterward. The matrons had pharmaceutical aids for those who couldn't achieve this state naturally. Lotus powder mixed with wine created dissociation. Poppy extracts numbed sensation. But these came with risks. Too much and women became actually unconscious, which was forbidden. The dosing had to be precise, creating absence of self while maintaining technical awareness. Chen learned the aftermath was often worse than the act itself. Women who'd successfully maintained corpse-like stillness during service would later collapse in their quarters, bodies shaking uncontrollably as suppressed responses fought to surface. Some screamed silently for hours, mouths open, but no sound emerging. Still afraid to break the silence training. Others developed permanent tremors from the muscle control required. The physicians who oversaw this system kept detailed notes, treating it as medical curiosity rather than torture. They documented optimal breathing rates, muscle relaxation sequences, meditation techniques for consciousness suppression. Their clinical tone made the horror more absolute, reducing women to biological machines programmed for non-responsive function. Some women found escape through complete mental fracture. They achieved the required emptiness by actually vacating their minds permanently. These women continued serving, continued breathing, continued moving through palace routines, but something essential had departed. Other maids called them the gone ones, bodies that walked and worked but housed no person anymore. The few who maintained sanity did so through careful compartmentalization. They created internal spaces where some fragment of self could hide, emerging only in absolute privacy. But maintaining corpse-like stillness became impossible when their bodies betrayed them through the one function they couldn't control, their monthly cycles. Because in the Forbidden City, a woman's biology itself became a weapon, Mina, and missing a single monthly cycle could trigger an execution. She counted days on hidden marks scratched into jade, 28, 29, 30. And with each passing hour, her terror grew. In the Forbidden City, menstruation meant surveillance. Every palace maid had to report her cycle to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, recording start dates, end dates, flow intensity, any irregularities. Missing a report meant 50 bamboo strikes. but reporting inaccurately could mean death because a missed cycle might indicate pregnancy. An unauthorized pregnancy was treason against the imperial bloodline. The system trapped women between competing impossibilities: report too early and face beating for false alarm that wastes ministerial time. Report too late and face execution for concealing potential contamination of palace purity. The margin for error was measured in hours, not days. Chen watched women scratch counting marks on any surface they could find: jade ornaments, wooden bed frames, even their own skin when nothing else was available. Physical inspections were degrading beyond description. Palace physicians, always male, would examine women who reported irregularities. These examinations happened in open courtyards where other maids were forced to watch, part medical procedure, part public humiliation. The physicians used metal instruments to check for signs of pregnancy, their cold tools and clinical efficiency making the violation complete, but the real torture was the waiting. A woman whose cycle was even one day late entered a state of escalating panic. She couldn't eat. Nausea would be seen as pregnancy confirmation. She couldn't rest. Exhaustion suggested bodily changes. She couldn't work efficiently. Distraction implied guilt. The palace matrons watched for these signs, creating a feedback loop where fear itself became evidence of wrongdoing. Chen witnessed the fate of Li, a kitchen maid whose cycle had always been irregular. When it disappeared for 40 days, she was dragged before the ministry. Her protests that she'd never been near any man fell on deaf ears. Penalty for being wrong was 100 bamboo strikes administered over 3 days. Not enough to kill, but sufficient to leave permanent damage. Li survived the beating, but lost the ability to walk without a cane. The cruelest aspect was that many women's cycles naturally stopped under palace conditions. Malnutrition, stress, and constant physical demands could suppress menstruation for months. But the system made no allowances for natural causes. A stopped cycle meant suspected pregnancy regardless of impossibility. 3 women died that month from the anxiety alone, their bodies shutting down under the weight of anticipated punishment. Some women tried to force their cycles to remain regular. They'd consume dangerous herbs, insert foreign objects, even injure themselves to produce blood on schedule. The aftermath of these desperate measures often caused infections that palace physicians refused to treat. The self-harm was considered another form of rebellion against imperial property. The recording was meticulous and invasive. Each woman's cycle was tracked on wooden tablets, creating a massive archive of female biology. Patterns were analyzed, irregularities investigated, connections drawn between women whose cycles aligned. The ministry believed that synchronized menstruation indicated secret gatherings or emotional bonds between maids, both forbidden activities. For women who served in the inner palace, the scrutiny intensified. They might encounter male royalty, making pregnancy theoretically possible. These women faced monthly virginity examinations in addition to cycle tracking. The examinations were performed by elderly matrons who'd internalized the system's cruelty, their rough handling designed to punish as much as inspect. The psychological warfare extended to false accusations. Matrons would sometimes claim a woman had missed her report when she hadn't, forcing her to prove her innocence through physical examination. The terror of these false charges often disrupted women's cycles, creating the very irregularity they were accused of hiding. Chen learned to read the signs of a woman approaching cycle panic, the compulsive counting, the hidden marks, the specific tension that built as each day passed without blood. She saw women celebrate the arrival of painful cramps like a reprieve from execution. She watched others collapse in relief at the first spot of red, knowing they'd survived another month. But for those confirmed pregnant, the real nightmare was just beginning. The palace had special protocols for women carrying unauthorized life, and these procedures made everything else seem merciful by comparison. The wet nurse heard her own infant's cries echoing from the servants' quarters, while the imperial baby suckled at her breast. Milk meant for her child, now feeding her oppressors. The Forbidden City required 40 wet nurses for each imperial baby, not as backup or rotation. All 40 served simultaneously, creating an industrial milk production system that prioritized royal infants while destroying common families. These women, selected from among palace maids who become pregnant and lower-S mothers from surrounding districts, entered a specific hell designed around their biology. The selection process began immediately after birth. Inspectors arrived at hospitals and homes, checking new mothers for milk quality, quantity, and health indicators. Women who passed initial screening were taken within days of giving birth, their own infants left with relatives or wet nurses who couldn't meet imperial standards. The irony was razor sharp. She women deemed good enough to nourish royal babies weren't permitted to feed their own. Inside the palace, wet nurses lived in specialized quarters near the imperial nurseries. Every 3 hours, day and night, they reported for feeding duty. 10 women at a time would line up while royal babies were passed between them, each infant sampling multiple sources to ensure the highest quality nutrition. The women stood in rows like livestock, exposed from waist up, while supervisors monitored feeding efficiency and milk flow. Chen served rotation in the nursery wings and witnessed the systematic dehumanization. Wet nurses were referred to by numbers, not names. Their diets were strictly controlled, specific soups and grls designed to maximize milk production. They were forbidden from experiencing strong emotions that might sour the milk. Crying for their own children earned punishment. Expressing any preference for feeding schedules was rebellion. The wet nurses' own babies had a 60% mortality rate. Without their mother's milk, fed on rice water and thin substitutes by overwhelmed relatives, these infants died at rates that would constitute genocide in any other context, but their deaths weren't even recorded in official documents. Also, royal babies didn't merit notation in palace records. The milk theft went beyond simple feeding. Palace physicians had theories about essence transference. Sir believed royal babies could absorb positive qualities through milk. This meant wet nurses underwent personality testing, intelligence examinations, even beauty evaluations. Women deemed to have undesirable traits were expelled, their milk considered contaminated. The selection criteria changed with imperial whims, creating constant anxiety among the nurses. Physical modifications were sometimes required. Nurses with inverted nipples underwent painful stretching procedures. Those whose milk flow was deemed insufficient received hormone treatments derived from animal glands. Some women's milk dried up from grief over their own children, leading to brutal force, feeding regimens designed to restart production. The palace treated their bodies as machines, applying whatever modifications were needed to maintain output. The psychological torture was precisely calculated. Wet nurses could sometimes hear their own infants crying in the servants' quarters, close enough to recognize the sound, too far to respond. Guards were instructed to carry crying babies past the nursery windows, allowing mothers glimpses of their children while they fed imperial offspring. Some women broke completely, attempting to smuggle their own babies into feeding rotations. These attempts ended in execution for both mother and child. The economics were staggering. Each wet nurse provided approximately 20,000 feedings over their service period, representing hundreds of gallons of milk. Multiply by 40 nurses per royal baby. Factor in the dozen or more imperial children at any time, and the scale becomes clear. Thousands of women's bodies converted into milk production facilities, their own children sacrificed to sustain the imperial line. But the milk theft was just part of a larger economic machine. The palace extracted years of unpaid labor from these women beyond nursing. Between feedings, they worked as seamstresses, cleaners, and general servants. Their compensation was mere subsistence, the thin soup, shared quarters, and the promise that their surviving children might receive palace employment when grown. Some nurses attempted resistance through contamination. They'd eat forbidden foods, hoping to make their milk unpalatable. They'd fake illness to avoid feeding duty, but the palace had countermeasures for everything. Food contamination led to force, feeding of approved diets. Illness resulted in invasive examinations and punishment for attempted sabotage of imperial nutrition. The wet nurses who survived their terms left broken in specific ways. Many couldn't bear to look at their own children afterward, seeing only the royal babies they'd been forced to prioritize. Others compulsively leaked milk for years after service, their bodies trained to overproduce. The lucky ones were those who forgot in chi trauma, manifesting as complete amnesia about their palace years, and the women who supervised this extraction had themselves been broken by the same system, creating a generational cycle of victims becoming victimizers. The bamboo rod shook in Aunt Chen's hand as she raised it above the crying girl. 20 years ago she'd been beaten in this same spot, and now survival meant becoming the monster. The palace called them ants. Senior maids who'd survived decades of service and now enforced the same brutalities they'd once endured. This wasn't natural progression, but calculated psychology. Forbidden City understood that the most effective torturers were those who knew exactly how much pain each punishment caused, who remembered their own screams and could calibrate suffering with precision. Aunt Chen had entered the palace at 13, now 43. She commanded a section of junior maids with the same cold efficiency once used against her. She knew which strikes would leave temporary welts versus permanent scars. She understood how many hours a girl could kneel on broken porcelain before infection set in. Her expertise came from having endured every punishment she now administered. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Young maids who showed exceptional submission were gradually given tiny authorities, distributing food portions, assigning sleeping positions, reporting infractions. Each small power came with impossible choices. Report a friend's mistake or share her punishment. Strike another girl or receive double strikes yourself. The palace system made complicity mandatory for survival. Chen watched her younger self in the trembling girl before her. Same age, same rural accent, same tears. But empathy was luxury she couldn't afford. The kindest women often became the cruelest enforcers because they understood the alternative. Show mercy and face accusation of corruption. Demonstrate insufficient zeal and lose the marginal privileges that made survival possible. The mathematics of oppression were simple. Someone would suffer better than you. The ants developed signature cruelties that matched their own traumas. Those who'd been starved withheld food with particular spite. Women who'd endured sexual abuse became vicious about virginity inspections. Maids who lost children enforced pregnancy protocols with devastating thoroughness. They recreated their own suffering in endless cycles, each generation training the next in precision brutality. One aunt beat 30 girls to death in a single year, earning a reputation that made junior maids faint at her approach. But her efficiency came from experience. She'd calculated exactly how much force would cause submission without creating martyrs. Dead girls required replacement, causing administrative hassle. Broken girls could still work, and their visible suffering reminded others to comply. The psychological manipulation went deeper than simple violence. Ants would choose favorites among new girls, showing small kindnesses that created desperate attachment. Then they'd withdraw affection suddenly, leaving girls frantically trying to regain approval. This emotional whiplash was more effective than any beating. It made girls complicit in their own degradation, constantly striving to please their tormentors. Some ants justified their actions through twisted logic. They claimed harsh training prepared girls for palace realities. Better to learn from someone who'd survived than discover limits through fatal error. This rationalization let them sleep at night, transforming torture into teaching, cruelty into care. They'd repeat phrases while beating girls, "This hurts me more than you," or "Someday you'll thank me," words they'd once heard through their own screams. The palace rewarded effective ants with marginal comforts, private sleeping spaces, better food, occasional communication with outside family. These privileges seemed enormous after decades of deprivation. But they came with strings that tightened like noose. Any ant showing excessive mercy lost everything. The system ensured that kindness meant returning to the bottom of the hierarchy they'd spent lifetimes climbing. Chen discovered the deepest horror wasn't in becoming cruel, but in feeling relief at others' suffering. When junior maids were punished, it meant she wasn't. When new girls arrived, it meant fresh targets for palace rage. She caught herself calculating which girls would break fastest, identifying weaknesses that could deflect attention from her own section. Survival required not just participating in oppression, but excelling at it. But individual cruelty pad beside the systematic destruction of female bonds. The palace had perfected something diabolical, making women complicit in each other's destruction, turning friendship itself into a weapon of control. Natural solidarity became impossible when anyone might be tomorrow's enforcer or today's spy. The ants represented the system's ultimate victory. They proved that sufficient pressure could transform any victim into villain, that survival instincts would override moral principles, that women could be made to destroy each other more efficiently than any external oppressor. They were living proof that the palace's true genius lay not in breaking bodies, but in corrupting souls. The wooden rod struck her abdomen for the 40th time, and she felt something inside tear loose. The palace punishment had begun. They called it discipline through adjustment, a euphemism for systematic internal mutilation designed to destroy reproductive capacity while keeping women functional for labor. Unlike male eunuchs who underwent single surgical procedures, female palace workers faced repeated brutal interventions that accumulated damage over years of service. The process began with force, feeding. Women scheduled for adjustment were given wine mixed with powerful narcotics, lotus extract, poppy tears, and herbs that induced dissociation. The dosage was carefully calibrated, enough to prevent full resistance, not enough to block pain completely. The palace wanted women conscious enough to remember their punishment, but impaired enough to prevent effective struggle. Next came the positioning. Women were stretched between wooden frames, arms, and legs, bound to prevent protective movements. Senior matrons supervised while younger enforcers, often recently adjusted women themselves, carried out the beating. The primary tool was a rounded wooden rod, thick as a man's wrist, polished smooth from generations of use. The technique required specific training. Strike too high and ribs might break, killing valuable workers. Strike too low and damage might be insufficient. The target zone was precise, the lower abdomen, where reproductive organs nestled unprotected by bone. 40 strikes was standard for first offenses. Repeat punishments increased by 20s until women either died or achieved the desired sterility. Chen witnessed her first adjustment during her 3rd year of service. The victim was Ming, a kitchen maid who'd been caught sending messages to her village family. As punishment for divided loyalty, she was sentenced to reproductive correction. The sound haunted Chen for decades. Not screams which were muffled by leather strips, but the wet thudding of wood against flesh, rhythmic as drum beats. After the beating came the healing phase. Plant ash mixed with salt was packed against the abdomen to draw out corruption. The mixture burned like acid, creating additional agony while supposedly preventing infection. Women lay in isolation cells for days, bodies rigid with pain, while matrons monitored for signs of internal bleeding. Only 3 in 10 survived the procedure without permanent visible damage. The internal injuries were precisely what palace administrators intended. Massive bruising of reproductive organs often led to scarring that blocked fallopian tubes. Repeated trauma could cause the uterus to detach partially, creating chronic pain and eliminating pregnancy possibility. Some women experienced prolapse, organs shifting position permanently. The palace physicians documented these outcomes with satisfaction, noting successful correction of rebellious tendencies. Those who lived faced a slower death through infection and chronic pain. The plant ash treatment, while preventing some immediate infections, created its own complications. Women developed adhesions, internal tissues fusing together in response to trauma. Digestive systems were compromised by organ displacement. Many lost bladder control from nerve damage, adding humiliation to agony. But some women chose an even more horrific fate. Rather than wait for palace-administered punishment, they performed their own adjustments using whatever implements they could find: kitchen knives, broken pottery, sharpened bamboo. Desperation drove them to self-mutilation that often exceeded official punishments in severity. The palace's response to these acts was telling. Women who survived self-adjustment still received official beatings for attempting to control their own correction. The psychological aftermath matched the physical trauma. Women who'd undergone adjustment often couldn't stand being touched, even by female friends offering comfort. They developed specific phobias: inability to look at wooden objects, panic at the smell of ash, involuntary flinching at counting rhythms. Some retreated into complete silence. their minds fleeing bodies that had become sites of torture. The system's efficiency was terrifying. By creating graduated punishments, the palace ensured that women lived in constant fear of the next level. First-time offenders who survived their 40 strikes knew that any future infraction meant 60. This knowledge created self-policing more effective than any guard system. Women would betray friends rather than risk advancement to the next punishment tier. Medical documentation from the period written in clinical language that amplified the horror detailed successful outcomes. Women rendered permanently sterile, but still capable of manual labor. The physicians noted with approval that adjusted women often worked harder than before. Driven by terror of receiving additional corrections, they'd transformed reproductive assault into a management strategy. Faced with such brutalization, a group of palace women decided on the unthinkable, final self. They would murder the emperor himself, the source of all their suffering. 16 women crept through moonlit corridors, clutching silk ribbons and curtain cords, their makeshift weapons for history's most desperate assassination attempt. October 1542. The Forbidden City slept under autumn fog while Emperor Jering lay in drugged slumber, exhausted from another night of alchemical experiments and sexual excess. The conspirators had planned for months, communicating through gestures during group punishments, hiding weapons in plain sight as decorative elements. Their leader, Consort Duan, had been forced to watch her sister beaten to death for crying during rape. Tonight, they would end the source of all palace suffering. The plan was simple because complexity meant discovery. 16 palace women with access to the emperor's bedchamber would slip inside during the deepest sleep hours. Using silk scarves and curtain cords, the only weapons they could obtain without suspicion, they would strangle him before guards could respond. Quick, silent, final. The abandoned needlework materials and hair ribbons that littered palace quarters would become instruments of imperial death. They moved like ghosts through corridors they'd cleaned for years, feet silent on stones they knew by touch. Each woman carried her own trauma. Yang had been adjusted 3 times. Wang had lost 2 children to wet nursing. Lady Kui bore scars from experimental tortures. Their diverse sufferings unified into single purpose. The emperor must die. Reaching the bedchamber required passing 3 guard posts. But palace security focused on external threats, not the broken women who emptied chamber pots and changed silk sheets. The conspirators had practiced their approach for weeks, timing guard rotations, memorizing which floor stones creaked. They passed the first checkpoint by crawling below sidelines, the second by timing their movement with guards' tea breaks. The third stood empty, the guards gambling in a side room, confident that no threat could emerge from within. Inside the chamber, Emperor Jia lay sprawled across his bed, mouth open, completely vulnerable. The women had rehearsed this moment using practiced dummies made of rolled blankets. Consort Duan would loop the silk around his neck while others held limbs to prevent struggle. The knot had been practiced hundreds of times, a sliding noose that would tighten with resistance. But in the darkness, with shaking hands and racing hearts, everything went wrong. The knot that would have saved thousands of women slipped. Instead of a sliding noose, trembling fingers tied a fixed loop that couldn't tighten properly. A silk touched the emperor's throat. He stirred. Panic destroyed coordination. Some women pulled while others hesitated. The silk cord tangled with bed curtains. Someone knocked over a porcelain vase. The crash woke Judging fully. He thrashed, screamed, clawed at the loose silk around his neck. The conspirators had seconds before guards arrived. Some fled immediately. Others tried desperately to complete their mission, pulling cords in different directions, their inexperience with violence turning assassination into chaos. Lady Wang attempted to smother him with pillows while Yang tried to correct the knot. Their fumbling desperation sealed their fate. Guards burst in to find the emperor purple, faced but breathing, surrounded by weeping women still clutching their pathetic weapons. The rebellion had lasted less than 3 minutes. Their families had no idea they'd just been condemned to death alongside the conspirators. Palace justice didn't stop at individual punishment. Treason required generational erasure. The interrogations began immediately, not to determine guilt. The women had been caught literally red-handed, but to uncover the full network. Torture experts worked through the night, breaking fingers, burning flesh, extracting names. But the conspirators had been clever in their recruitment. They'd involved only those already destroyed by palace life, women with nothing left to lose. The circle remained small because hope itself had been so thoroughly crushed. The executions were public spectacle. All 16 women died by slow slicing in the palace courtyard, the process taking 3 days to complete. But first, they watched their families suffer the same fate. Mothers, sisters, daughters, even infant nieces, all condemned by association. The message was clear. Rebellion against the emperor would result in the destruction of entire bloodlines. The reprisals would make previous punishments seem merciful. Every palace woman faced increased scrutiny. Group gatherings were forbidden. Women couldn't possess any fabric longer than a handspan. Even looking at curtain cords became suspicious behavior. The failed assassination had given the palace excuse to implement controls they'd always desired, but couldn't previously justify. Jing himself became paranoid beyond reason. He moved bedchambers nightly, trusted no female servants, demanded male eunuchs test everything he consumed. The women's desperate attempt to end their suffering had only intensified it for those who remained. And the failed assassination triggered a new wave of brutality that would culminate in the mass murder of 2,800 women, bringing us back to that blood-soaked morning in 1421. Lady Kui dipped her brush in ink mixed with her own blood, determined to record what the palace historians were already beginning to delete. April 22, 1421. As bodies still cooled in the execution grounds, imperial historians gathered in the palace archives. Their task: eliminate any record of the previous day's massacre, not minimize or reframe, completely erase. 2,800 women would vanish from history as thoroughly as their bodies would disappear into mass graves. The emperor had decreed that the event never happened, and in imperial China, the emperor's word could rewrite reality itself. The mechanics of erasure were methodical. First, destroy primary records. The Ministry of Internal Affairs maintained detailed logs of all palace workers' names, ages, villages of origin, dates of service. These documents were burned in special furnaces designed to leave no readable ash. Next, eliminate secondary references, payment records, food allocation lists, dormitory assignments, ADAs, any document that might indicate 2,800 people had once existed required destruction or alteration. But Lady Kui, a senior palace administrator with access to these records, had anticipated the erasure. Days before the massacre, when execution orders began circulating, she'd started her own documentation. Using traditional materials that would seem unremarkable if discovered, poetry paper, painting silk, she recorded names, ages, stories. When standard ink ran low, she mixed her own blood with soot, creating permanent testimony written in the fluid of life itself. The official historians faced a complex task. Simply destroying records would leave suspicious gaps. Instead, they had to create alternate narratives. The 2,800 executed women became transferred to provincial palaces or returned to families for marriage. Death dates were scattered across decades to avoid patterns. The mass grave site was redecorated as a meditation garden, its freshly turned earth explained by landscaping projects. The imperial historians left 2,800 blank spaces in their consciousness, if not their documents. They developed a selective blindness, training themselves not to see discrepancies. When food allocations dropped by thousands of portions overnight, they recorded it as efficiency improvements. When an entire wing of servant quarters stood empty, they noted renovation in progress. Their complicity ran deeper than lies. They restructured their own perception to align with imperial commands. But Lady Kui had hidden her account when no one would think to look inside the decorative scrolls of her own funeral preparations. Traditional Chinese culture demanded that elderly palace servants prepare their own burial items. Her death poems were actually victim testimonies. Her afterlife paintings contained coded names and dates. She gambled that cultural taboos around death materials would protect her records from casual inspection. The erasure extended beyond documentation. Physical evidence required elimination too. Personal belongings of 2,800 women, wither, clothes, jewelry, letters from home, were collected and burned. The execution ground itself was renovated. Stones replaced, soil removed to depth of 6 ft. Cherry trees were planted in neat rows, their future blossoms meant to cover the ground that had drunk so much blood, but some evidence couldn't be destroyed. Other palace women remembered. They whispered names in darkness, taught new arrivals about the missing, maintained mental records of the erased. The true number of victims might have been even higher. Some estimates suggest additional hundreds died in the days following from injuries sustained while forced to watch the executions or from suicide driven by survivor guilt. The imperial censors worked to prevent any written record of these memories. Palace women were forbidden from learning to write beyond basic characters needed for inventory work. Those caught with personal writings faced the same adjustments used for physical rebellion. Oral histories were disrupted by constantly reassigning women to different sections, breaking up groups who might preserve collective memory. Yet, Lady Kui persisted as her health declined, welled, possibly hastened by the blood loss from her documentary efforts. She trained a successor in her hidden archives location. This woman, whose name was itself later erased, continued the work, generational transmission of suppressed history, hidden in funeral goods, in embroidery patterns, in songs disguised as labis. The effectiveness of the erasure was nearly complete. No official Chinese history mentions the 1421 massacre. Western scholars who later gained access to imperial archives found perfect documentary silence around those dates. If not for Lady Kui's blood-written testimony discovered centuries later hidden in a tomb's decorative scrolls, the murder of 2,800 women would have achieved its intended outcome. Perfect historical non-existence. And now, after building through centuries of systematic brutalization, we return to that April morning when 2,800 women learned that their lives were worth less than one man's reputation. The sun rose on April 21st, 1421, illuminating a scene of methodical annihilation. In the Forbidden City's largest courtyard, 2,800 palace women knelt in perfect rows, back straight despite the terror, maintaining the positioning discipline beaten into them even as they faced death. The Emperor Yanga had ordered their execution in response to a single rumor, that his favorite concubine's suicide stemmed from his sexual inadequacy rather than her supposed guilt over imagined crimes. The mechanics of mass murder required organization. Guards divided the women into groups of 50, each assigned to teams of executioners who specialized in lynchai, death by 1,000 cuts. But this wouldn't be the prolonged artistry reserved for special criminals. Time constraints demanded efficiency. The cuts would be fewer but deeper, designed to kill within hours rather than days. Still, multiply hours by 2,800 and the mathematics of suffering become staggering. The sounds built in waves. First the whisper of blades being sharpened, metallic songs that merged into ominous harmony, then footsteps as executioners took positions, leather boots crushing cherry blossoms that had fallen overnight, the petals mixing with blood that would soon flow. The head executioner read charges in a voice that carried across the courtyard: conspiracy to spread seditious rumors, corruption of imperial dignity, collective treason against the dragon throne. As blades began their work, the forced silence of palace training finally broke. Screams erupted, not pleased for mercy, which training had eliminated, but pure expressions of agony. Some women called out names of children they'd never see again. Others recited fragments of Buddhist prayers. Many said nothing, their voices stolen by years of enforced muteness, dying as silently as they'd lived. By midday, the courtyard stones were invisible beneath blood. Executioners rotated in shifts, exhausted by the sheer scale of killing. Bodies were dragged to growing piles at the courtyard's edges, creating mountains of flesh that would require days to burn. The air filled with iron scent of blood mixing with incense. The palace burned to mask the smell, jasmine, and death, creating a perfume that would haunt survivors forever. Emperor Yungla himself appeared at the height of the slaughter, carried in a sedan chair to observe his command's fulfillment. He stayed only minutes, long enough to confirm the massacre's reality, then retreated to his chambers. Historical accounts suggest he spent that night with new concubines, proving his virility to himself while thousands died for questioning it. The killing continued past sunset. Torches were lit to illuminate the final executions, casting dancing shadows that made the scene even more nightmarish. The last woman to die was reportedly the youngest, a girl who'd entered palace service just weeks before. Caught in the nets of collective punishment, she died calling for a mother she'd never see again. Her voice thin as thread before the blades silenced it forever. Within hours, the cover-up began. Bodies were burned in mass pièces outside the city, their ashes scattered in the river to prevent any memorialization. The courtyard underwent complete renovation. Every stone replaced, every trace of blood erased. Cherry trees were planted in strategic rows, their roots drinking deeply from soil enriched by human remains. By the time sunrise came again, physical evidence of the massacre had vanished, but the erasure went deeper. Palace records were altered retroactively, showing these women had never existed. Their families were told various lies. Daughters had died of sudden illness, been transferred to distant provinces, chosen religious retirement. The few who pressed for truth faced implied threats that silenced questions. An entire generation of women was deleted from history with bureaucratic efficiency that would inspire future genocides. Today, tour guides lead visitors through that same courtyard, now famous for its cherry blossoms. They speak of imperial glory, architectural marvels, cultural treasures. No plaques mark where 800 women died. No monuments honor their erased existence. The Palace Museum's official histories maintain the silence imposed 6 centuries ago. The greatest mass murder of women in recorded Chinese history remains unrecorded. Its victims as invisible in death as they were forced to be in life. This is what systematic dehumanization creates. A world where 800 human beings can be slaughtered and erased so completely that questioning their existence seems like historical fiction. The female eunuchs of China's imperial palace left no autobiographies, no portraits, no tombs. They exist now only in blood-written testimonies hidden in funeral scrolls and the genetic memory of generational trauma. Their story reminds us that history is written not just by victors, but by those who control which victims are allowed to exist in memory at